hatch, catching him in the rib cage. It bruised him severely, knocking the breath out of him and almost throwing him out of the commander's turret. He heard a groan, which sounded somewhat surprised, from inside the tank, but couldn't tell who it was. When he looked down, dense black smoke had already begun to fill the tank's interior. Without really thinking about what he was doing, acting in pure animal reflex, he hoisted himself out of the turret. There was a wave of pain. He just had time to curse himself for getting out of the turret. His duty clearly was to have gone into the hall to help the others, when an intensely hot spurt of flame erupted upward from the turret. He knew what had caused it. Pieces of metal from the projectile and pieces torn from the hull itself had ripped into the brass cases of the 75mm cannon ammunition, slicing them open and spilling their powder. Then the powder had caught fire. When unconfined powder burns, it does not explode. The explosion came a moment later, as intact shell cases and gasoline fumes detonated. Bellman felt himself flying through the air. He landed on his back upon the rocky ground, his shoulders striking the ground first, throwing him into a backward somersault and knocking what was left of the wind in his lungs out of him. When he came to rest, he was conscious, but was incapable of movement. He was dimly aware of a second shot from a tank cannon, a sharp cracking noise, followed immediately by a heavier thump. Despite the pain in his ribs, he tried to get control of himself. He forced himself to take a deep breath, and then another, and another. Finally, he was able to roll onto his side to see what had happened to the second M4A2, the other tank which had come out with him to locate and assist the 705th Field Artillery Battalion. It was immobile. There was no one in the turret, and oily smoke oozed out around the fuel tanks and the turret ring. No one had gotten out of that one. He heard the sound of a tank engine. He let himself fall slowly onto his face. He would play dead, though it was a slim chance at best. The crew of the German tank would more than likely give him a burst with the 7.93mm machine gun. Prisoners were a nuisance in fast-moving tank warfare. He closed his eyes and tried to breathe very slowly. His only hope was to make them think that he had been killed when his tank blew up. If he tried to surrender, all he would do would be to give them a better target. The PZKW-4 ground to a halt near him. It was now the standard German medium tank, an efficient killing machine, into which had been incorporated all the lessons the German Panzertruppen had learned in France and Russia, and here in Africa. Bellman would have been willing to admit, privately, that it was a better tank than the Sherman. He knew the German tank commander was watching him. Then he heard the crunch of footsteps on the gritty soil. "Was ist er?" "Ein Offizier, Leutnant, mit einem gelben Blatt." "Ein Major?" the first voice said. "Is he dead?" "No," the self-confident voice above him said, matter-of-factly. "He's breathing, plain dead." Good God, is my pretense that transparent? There was the sound of more booted feet on the gritty soil. "Please do not make it necessary for me to kill you, Herr Major," the first voice said. A hand grabbed his shoulder and rolled him onto his back. Bellman opened his eyes and found himself looking into the muzzle of a .45 Colt automatic. It was in the hands of a young, blond, good-looking lieutenant of the Afrika Korps. He wore the black tunic of the Panzertruppen above standard gray Wehrmacht trousers. He smiled at Bellman. Then he reached down with his free hand and took Bellman's .45 from his shoulder holster. "You may sit up, please, Major," he said. His English was British accented. "Are you injured?" Bellman sat up. The lieutenant handed Bellman's .45 to the soldier with him. Another nice-looking, clean-cut, blond-headed boy, Bellman thought. "Will you also give me, please, the holster?" the lieutenant asked. Bellman pulled it over his head and held it out. The soldier held his Schmeise 9mm machine pistol between his knees, took Bellman's shoulder holster, and put it over his head. "Make sure that isn't loaded," the lieutenant cautioned. The soldier took the magazine from the butt of the .45, saw that it was full, emptied it, and then put it back in the pistol.